We find that not all Americans are modernists in the 20s, however, far from it. In this video, I'm going to talk about efforts at reform that we continue to see in the 20th century, and they're a really interesting mix as we get into the 20s of maintaining progressive reforms that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and resistance and reaction against progressive reforms and the emergence of a conservative movement. One wing of this conservative movement that we see emerge in the 20s is Protestant fundamentalism, an effort to read the Bible literally, to resist efforts to teach it in a way other than taken literally. And this is seen as a progressive response. Sorry, this is seen as a conservative response to a modernist skepticism about religion and about God. An interesting place where we find conservative and progressive causes aligned is in the cause of prohibition. This is a goal of progressive social reformers, but it was also a goal of Protestant fundamentalists who saw alcohol as a means by which people fell into sin. Progressives saw it as a great danger to society. And this is a very powerful alliance, so much so that the 18th Amendment to the Constitution is passed in 1919, which prohibits the manufacture and the sale of alcohol. Interestingly enough, it does not prohibit the consumption of alcohol. And this concern to limit the consumption of alcohol by prohibiting its manufacture on an industrial scale, which is basically what this amendment is doing, is reflected in concerns about immigration from Europe at the time. That after World War I, there's a huge wave of European immigration into the United States. A lot of it is coming from southern European countries. And so that means more Catholic immigrants, more of a drinking culture coming into the United States, and both progressives and Protestant fundamentalists are opposed to this. So along with the Prohibition Amendment, we also see efforts to discourage immigration, which you see in the Immigration Act of 1924. And this is a really interesting act, or really interesting approach to the question of immigration, in which the number of immigrants from each European country that were allowed to enter into the United States as new residents each year was to be no more than 2% of the number of immigrants already from that country found in the United States Census of 1890. And so this was designed to keep the population of the United States the same balance. So this meant that vastly more German immigrants were allowed to come into the United States than Italian immigrants. But this was kind of part of the goal of the Immigration Act, was to keep the society of the United States roughly the same, to keep rates of immigration from different countries roughly the same. And this is part of the reform that we see with the Prohibition Act. In the end, the Prohibition Act's not going to be respected. It is at first, and it leads to an initial decline in alcohol consumption, but it's such a broad, sweeping change, something that had been a huge part of American society, now universally condemned, and yet there are so many loopholes in the law that no one is going to take this seriously, or very few people are going to take this seriously. What we find instead is that people stock up massively before it goes into effect, so that some places don't actually ever run out of alcohol. We find that bootlegging becomes an extremely profitable industry, producing illegal alcohol, and that as an illegal substance, it means that it's a gateway to all kinds of other crime and tax avoidance and violence and gang warfare between different bootlegging gangs that we find in American cities in the 1920s. It's also the case that the federal government experiences a significant loss of revenue from taxes that they otherwise would claim on alcohol that was sold. In the end, there is less drinking done, there's less alcohol consumed, that's certainly true. But in fact, there are more deaths due to alcoholism because the type of alcohol that people are producing at home is of irregular quality and can be quite dangerous. At the same time, there is nothing like enough police enforcement or enough funds invested in police enforcement to fully implement this act, and people at the highest levels of political society, including presidents, are flaunting it. So prohibition is not going to be successful. It's an interesting combination of progressive efforts to reform society through the government, combined with perhaps more conservative efforts to reform society that come out of this Protestant fundamentalist movement. And we see a similarly interesting mix if we look at the early presidents of the 1920s. Warren Harding is famous for promoting his candidacy as a return to normalcy. So he says, we've had all these progressive visionaries like Wilson and Roosevelt. Now we want to get back to someone who's normal, who doesn't have strong agendas that they're trying to ram through, but who's going to kind of return things to a pattern of life that we're comfortable with. And so this is the winning platform that Harding gets elected on. People want presidents to be normal at this time. They want to see power returned to Congress. They want to see the presidents be less visionaries with committed to radical agendas that they want to push through. Instead, they want to see government be more limited, and that's what Harding and his associates do. Most especially, we read about Andrew Mellon, who was the third richest man in the world at the time, and who became the Secretary of the Treasury. And Mellon cuts the taxes on Americans, which had risen as high as 75% during the war. He cuts those down to 25%. And that's just one metric that shows you how during the 20s we see government becoming less progressive. You might say more conservative, depending how you're defining conservative, and in that it's becoming more limited. So the United States government is no longer trying to impose as many social reforms as it had during the progressive era. And in foreign policy terms, it's trying to be isolationist. It's trying to remove itself from the world scene. It's trying to remove itself from conflicts in Latin America. And we see American presence in Latin America reduced during this period. It refuses to sign up to join the Human Rights Tribunal in The Hague, just the same way that it refused to sign up for the League of Nations. And so we see what might be said to be something of a conservative reaction in government. Under Harding, and then after Harding's death in office, Calvin Coolidge, who tried even more so than Harding to remove the presidency from a prominent place in political life, and to make the presidency instead an enforcement office that carried out and implemented the laws passed by Congress. As a result of these policies, we see the American economy booming during the 1920s. And in 1928, Calvin Coolidge decides not to run for president. He's replaced by a man called Herbert Hoover, who had grown up in poverty, but through hard work and efficiency had made himself exceptionally wealthy, had then carved out a career in politics for himself, and that people approached Hoover's presidency with great confidence in the thought that these policies that had made them wealthier and wealthier throughout the 20s would continue into the 30s.